Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Devar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. This is Demai, Chapter 1, Halacha 2, in the Art Scroll, page 4b1. Now, we were covering leniencies on different kinds of fruits and vegetables in Chapter 1, Halacha 1, and now we're going to get into other kinds of leniencies. And in fact, the rest of the halachot that are coming up in one way or another are going to have leniencies on Demai. So that might help to shed a question on why is it that we're starting off Chapter 1, Halacha 1 with a list of these wild vegetables. We're going to get into other leniencies now, and these are going to be extra leniencies. The Mishnah says the Maaser Sheni of Demai is not subject to the law of the fifth. Now, Maaser Sheni has a bunch of rules with it. That's something that you're going to separate out after the other tithes. It's going to be a tenth of what's left from the other tithes, like Truma Gedola, Truma Rishon, and then you're going to save that, and you're going to transport that product to Jerusalem, or you're going to convert that into money, and that money is going to get sanctity, it's going to get Kedusha, and then you're going to bring it into the walls of Jerusalem, and you're either going to eat it there, or you are going to convert it into produce and eat it there. Now, normally when somebody goes and exchanges the vegetable or fruit into money so that they can go bring it to Jerusalem, make it very easy to transport, and also, fruits and vegetables can rot into money because then it's transportable and you can buy something when you need it. Generally, the Maaser Sheni is going to be consumed in the holiday of the foot. You're going to bring it in one of the three holidays. You're going to have a party and eat it there in the walls and really appreciate the Kedusha and sanctity of Kodesh Baruch Hu and a relationship with a Kodesh Baruch Hu. Normally, when you have the redemption of this, they're going to add an additional fifth. So whatever value that this had when you converted it into money, you have to add an extra fifth. There's a separation within and a separation from within without. So it's called a fifth because that's the fifth of the total price he pays. But in actuality, he's going to add 25% to the value that's being redeemed. We're going to get into that more in the other laws of redemption as well. It's always going to be the case. There's two kinds of ways to value it. One is going to be as if you're going to value it as a whole, or when you're going to add to it. If you're going to add to it, it's going to be a quarter, but it's called a fifth because if you're valuing it, it's going to be the principal plus the surcharge itself. And you can see that in Bavli Baba Metzia, by the way. That's in page 53b. The surcharge of the fifth, this is only going to be when you have definite Maaser Sheni. It's not when you have questionable Maaser Sheni. So Maaser Sheni of Demai is not going to be subject to this. It's only going to be actual Maaser Sheni. I get the benefit of teaching my son Torah, who's 4 months old. The Mishnah is going to continue. It's going to say, nor with the law of removal. And the law of removal is going to be where the Torah in Devarim 26:12 commands that on the last day of the Pesach of the 4th and the 7th year, the 7th year Shemitah cycle, that's going to be if somebody still has possession of any tithes from the earlier years, he's going to give them out to recipients. And in the case of Maaser Sheni, he has to destroy it if he can't eat the Maaser Sheni in Jerusalem in time. And the Mishnah is teaching that the rabbis waived this with Maaser Sheni of Demai, and this is going to be one of the leniencies. And we're going to get more into that into the Gemara. So the Mishnah continues. It says, it may be eaten by an onin. Onin is somebody who just had the death of one of their immediate relatives, like a father or a mother. And an onin may not eat definite Maaser Sheni. That, by the way, is a D'oraita rule. You can find that in Devarim 26:14. And the Mishnah is teaching that he may eat the Maaser Sheni of Demai. And we're going to get into the reason why we have this leniency. But very interesting to note that for Demai and the Maaser Sheni of Demai that this is waived. And then it says, and after it enters Jerusalem, it may go out and be redeemed. So according to biblical law, once Maaser Sheni enters Jerusalem, the walls take hold of it, and it's going to make it so that it can't leave. It has to be redeemed within the city. But what's going to happen here is that when you have definite Maaser Sheni that enter Jerusalem, the city's walls are said to have taken hold of it, which means you can't take it out of the city, and you can't redeem it for any other purpose. It has to be eaten right there. And this Mishnah is teaching that this rabbinic restriction does not apply to Demai. That's a big Kiddush. And as to Maaser Sheni of Demai, it's going to be treated with the same severity as Maaser Sheni of definite Tevel, in that it may not be taken outside of the city. So I want to point out this ruling by the Malki Tzedek. The Mishnah in Maaser Sheni is saying a similar ruling, but this is going to be in Maaser Sheni 3:6. It says, but Demai, after it enters Jerusalem, may go out and be redeemed. And the Gemara is stating that the Mishnah does not deal with Maaser Sheni of Demai, but with the Demai itself. In other words, the Tevel of Demai, which Maaser Sheni has not yet had separated out. This Mishnah is going to be ruling that after it enters Jerusalem, it may go out. And that's going to apply to Tevel of Demai. And unlike the other rulings, which apply to Maaser Sheni of Demai, this one is where you can take the Tevel of Demai outside, and you can separate Maaser Sheni outside of it and redeem it. But as to the Maaser Sheni of Demai, it's treated with the same severity of Maaser Sheni of definite Tevel. And the Mishnah continues and says we may abandon a small portion of it onto the road. And the idea is that normally with Maaser Sheni, you're not allowed to abandon any of it. You have to take precautions, says the Chazan Ish, to protect it from being dropped or lost along the way. Why? Because the Torah says it's yours to eat, and it has kedusha. So you're not allowed to willingly lose it. But the Maaser Sheni, if some of it falls along the way, the Maaser Sheni of Demai, some of it falls along the way, we're not concerned about it. It doesn't have the same level of sanctity or the same necessary precautions that you would need to do for regular Maaser Sheni. And also, if you found it along the way, says the Rambam, the Maaser Sheni of Demai, you don't need to protect it. So the Mishnah is going to continue and say that one may give it to an Am Haaretz, but one must eat a corresponding amount in Jerusalem. And that's to say that you can give Maaser Sheni of an Am Haaretz so that he will bring it to Jerusalem, but the rabbis are going to forbid giving definite Maaser Sheni to an Am Haaretz. Why? Because they're worried that he's going to eat it when he becomes Tameh. He's not going to know how to keep himself from becoming Tameh. And so he's going to eat something that has holiness and sanctity, and he's going to eat it when he's Tameh. So normal Maaser Sheni you can't give to an Am Haaretz, but to Am Haaretz for the Maaser Sheni of Demai, you can do it. And the catch is that you have to eat equal amount there in Jerusalem. In other words, that's to say that if you give the Maaser Sheni of Demai to an Am Haaretz, you have to treat it with an equivalent amount of his own money or money as Maaser Sheni, and it has to be spent on food to be eaten in Jerusalem. And the rabbis are basically imposing this to prevent people from taking advantage of this leniency and permit giving Maaser Sheni of Demai to the Am Haaretz. And there's another explanation by the Rosh about this Mishnah. It says that the Mishnah is speaking of someone who has redemption money of Maaser Sheni in Jerusalem, and if he needs it for the purposes other than those allowed by the Torah, he may transfer its sanctity to produce owned by another person, and the money becomes chulin, and the produce becomes sacred, and then he can use that money for mundane purposes, and the other party can eat the produce in Jerusalem. However, that Mishnah is ruling that one may not transfer sanctity of Maaser Sheni to the produce of an Am Haaretz who's going to eat it in Tuma, unless the sanctity of the redemption money originated from Maaser Sheni of Demai. And then the Maaser Sheni of Demai is going to be another story. So we're going to continue the Mishnah. It says one may deconsecrate it by transferring its sanctity from silver coins on to silver coins, or from copper coins on to copper coins. And why are we talking about that? Well, coins of definite Maaser Sheni cannot be deconsecrated by transferring their sanctity to coins of the same type. In other words, from silver coins to other silver coins. And because the standard method of doing deconsecration is transferring the sanctity of one object to a different object, so it can't be done with coins of the same type. And the rabbis are going to be lenient because the sanctity vested in the coin is merely that of Maaser Sheni of Demai. But in the case of definite Maaser Sheni, the constraint on exchanging similar coins is only where they were minted by the same king, and coins attributed to different kings can be exchanged because they are different types of objects. And so the Mishnah's leniency of Demai is regarding even coins that were minted by the same king. This is the comment by the Tosafot in Baba Metzia. So the Mishnah is going to finish up, and it's going to say also from silver coins onto copper coins. So in the relation of silver coins and copper coins, they are not considered to be currency but produce. That's the note by Baba Metzia 45a in the Bavli. And the Maaser Sheni money may not be exchanged for produce outside of Jerusalem. And why is that? Because there's a scriptural source. And this is why the silver coins of definite Maaser Sheni may not be exchanged for copper coins. And if there is a pressing need for such a transfer, the restriction can be waived, but silver coins of Maaser Sheni of Demai are allowed to be exchanged like this. So we're going to continue with the rest of the Mishnah. It's going to say, or from copper coins onto produce. And over here, the idea about the copper coins onto produce is that money of definite Maaser Sheni may not be exchanged for produce outside Jerusalem. And the Mishnah is teaching that if the Maaser Sheni comes from Demai, the coins can be exchanged for produce even outside of Jerusalem. And this may not be done with copper coins, only silver ones. And that's going to be from the Derech Hamuna. I'm on the Hilchos Maaser Sheni 457. And the Gemara, the Mishnah is going to continue. And it's going to say, one may redeem the produce again, and this one need not take that produce onto which sanctity of Maaser Sheni was transferred to Jerusalem. Rather, if someone wants, he can redeem it the other way. And that's going to be the words of Rabbi Meir. But the sages say the produce must be brought up to Jerusalem, eaten there, and it cannot be redeemed. So I want to point out the idea of Rabbi Meir. If the produce was used to deconsecrate definite Maaser Sheni money, he may not be exchanged for anything, but it can be eaten in Jerusalem. And according to Rabbi Meir, this restriction is not Maaser Sheni of Demai, and this produce is used to deconsecrate Maaser Sheni money of Demai, and it doesn't need to be brought to Jerusalem. It can be exchanged elsewhere for coins. The sages are saying that the produce used to deconsecrate the money of the Maaser Sheni of Demai has the same status as produce used to deconsecrate money of definite Maaser Sheni, and so it may not be redeemed, and it must be eaten in Jerusalem. So in many ways, the Gemaras that are coming up are actually going to be some of the most important Gemaras in actually all of the Masechet, because it's going to give us a deeper insight as to what the originator of Demai actually was thinking. This is Kohen Gadol. This is Yochanan, Kohen Gadol. And it's going to give us a greater insight as to how this works. And one of the questions that's going to be floating out there is going to be, what do we do with this Demai, would it be like doubtful tevel or not? In other words, let's say you separate out, or the Am Haaretz did separate out Truma Gedola. Fine. Then that's not really tevel. However, if you go and you get this Demai, and now you have to separate out the next set of tithes, that's the Maaser Rishon, and then you take out the tithes which is going to be the Truma Maaser that goes to the Goan. Again, this is all Demai. That's going to be fine, and then from there you separate out the Maaser Sheni. Fine. But if you got this Demai and you separate it out because you can keep it, the Maaser Rishon, and you don't take out any of the other tithes, you just don't do it. Now, you didn't take out the Truma Maaser, which is supposed to go to a Goan, and the question is now, do you have actual tevel in your possession? So it's a big question as to what's going to happen with this, and we're going to get into resolving whether the rabbis are going to be treating Demai like doubtful tevel, in which case it's the weight of having to take out these tithes is very, very serious, or is it going to be something that's just going to be a rabbinic restriction? We're going to get into that. So the Gemara starts off, and very fittingly, talking about the ruling by Yochanan Kohen Gadol, and the ruling that the obligation of removal does not extend to Maaser Sheni of Demai. So the Mishnah indicated that the obligation does apply to definite Maaser Sheni, but the Gemara is going to ask a question. So the Gemara says, but did Yochanan Kohen Gadol bring an end to the recital of the Maaser confession? So as a bit of history, in fact, that's one of the things that he did. He put into play the Demai laws, but he also made the official recital of when you say the Maaser Sheni, he brought that to an end. So the question is there going to be a link between the removal of the tithes and the confession? The Gemara says, and thus in the case of definite Maaser Sheni, the obligation of removal still applies. And in the case of Maaser Sheni of Demai, one does not need to remove it. So that's an interesting insight. So over here, the Gemara is assuming that Rabbi Yochanan Kohen Gadol abolished not only the confession, but perhaps also the mitzvah of removing the tithes in the possession. So it cannot be suggested that the Mishnah predates Yochanan Kohen Gadol's decree, because it was Yochanan Kohen Gadol who put in the laws of Demai. That's going to be the insight by the Vilna Goan. So the Mishnah, just to recap on the Mishnah is saying the Maaser Sheni of Demai is not subject to the laws of the fifth, nor to the laws of removal. So that's going to be where, just to recap, and this is from the Torah itself in Devarim 26:12, it's commanding that on the last day of Pesach of the 4th and 7th year, in the 7-year Shemitah cycle, if you still have in your possession any tithes from the preceding years, you have to give it to the respective recipients, and in the case of Maaser Sheni, he has to destroy it. And he cannot eat the Maaser Sheni in Jerusalem by that time, he has to do it. And this mitzvah is known as the removal of tithes. So the Mishnah is teaching that the rabbis waived this requirement with the respect of Maaser Sheni of Demai. And so the question is that if you're seeing it in the Mishnah and the rabbis are saying that you don't need to do this removal as part of where you're taking out the leftover tithes and distributing them, or just removing them, the question is that okay, he gave up he instituted Demai, he gave up the requirement of making the confession for Maaser, and now the question is, does this removal get sidelined as well? We see this with the Demai, but what about the regular Maaser? And so we're seeing here that with definite Maaser Sheni, the obligation of removal still remains. And the Mishnah stated it may be eaten by an onan. This is also going to be very important because we're trying to hone in on what exactly is Demai. What exactly is the status of Demai? And is this really going to be something that's really going to be treated like some form of doubtful tevel? Or in the halacha, is it going to be treated more like a rabbinic restriction? So we can learn a lot about this from the laws of onan. And we know, normally speaking, that an onan is limited in eating the Maaser Sheni, and is limited in a lot of things because when you're eating the Maaser Sheni, you have to be in an elevated, happy state, and an onan is not really going to be in that state. The question is now what happens with Maaser Sheni of Demai and an onan. So the Brisa taught that Maaser Sheni of Demai can be eaten in a state of aninus. That's going to be by an onan who's mourning for a close relative. But it may not be eaten in a state of tuma. Well, that's very interesting. So the Rosh Hashanah says whether the person is tamei and the Maaser Sheni is tahor, or whether the Maaser Sheni is tamei and the person is tahor. That's really what this is saying. Now, there's a prohibition against eating definite Maaser Sheni when you are in mourning, and there's also a prohibition of eating definite Maaser Sheni when you're tamei. And both are coming from the same verse in Devarim 26:14, where it says, I have not eaten of it in my intense mourning, and I did not consume it in a state of tuma. This is actually linked together in a pasuk in the Torah. So why then, with Maaser Sheni of Demai, are the rabbis are going to treat one part of this statement, which is going to be the mourner, more leniently than with tuma? That's going to be the question that the Vilna Goan asks. And the idea, says the Rosh, is that the rabbis are prohibiting Maaser Sheni of Demai to be eaten in a state of tuma because they're afraid that otherwise the sanctity of Maaser Sheni would be treated lightly. And the rabbis did not impose such a prohibition with regard to a mourner because the state of the mourner is less common. And so allowing a mourner to eat the Maaser Sheni of Demai is less likely to lower the people's regard for it. In other words, they're trying to protect the way the Jewish people are going to perceive the sanctity of the Maaser Sheni, definite Maaser Sheni, and they don't want the people who are less learned to say, you can eat it in a state of tuma now. It's not such a big deal because you're actually breaking a Torah law. In other words, they're limiting it with the Maaser Sheni that's definite because with also the Maaser Sheni of Demai, because they're afraid that if people eat the Maaser Sheni of Demai, they're going to come to eat the Maaser Sheni that's definite in a state of tuma, and then you got a lot of problems. So that's why they left it like this. But again, this is helping us to hone in on the limits of the Demai ruling. The Gemara now is going to make a really deep point regarding the law of Maaser Sheni, that it can be eaten by. So the question. So it says it may be eaten by an onan, and the Brisa taught the Maaser Sheni of Demai may be eaten in a state of aninus, but it may not be eaten in a state of tuma. The Gemara gives a reason for the distinction, and it asks, what is the difference between aninus and tuma? And Rav Nachman explains, tuma is common and aninus is not common. And the rabbis are decreeing against something that is common in the case of the tuma, but they did not decree against something that's uncommon in the case of the mourner. So the Gemara now is going to get into this point about the mourner and tamei to help us to understand deeper the ruling of this Demai status for the foods. Rabbi Yossi says the rabbis did not decree Demai, or did not treat Demai even like doubtful tuma. So the Gemara continues, says, for in the case of doubtful tevel, where it is not known whether the tevel from one's produce has been rectified in regard to the Maaser Sheni, or whether it's not been rectified, would this Maaser Sheni not be forbidden to an onan out of doubt? And it should be, because of the possibility that it's actually going to be real definite biblical Maaser Sheni. And the Gemara finishes and says, but here in the Mishnah we say that it is permitted to an onin. So it looks like the rabbis did not treat Demai like it's going to be doubtful. It's going to be a doubtful thing. So what's going on here? So I want to look at explanation by the Pnei Moshe. There are two ways of understanding the rabbinic enactment of Demai. One is going to be where the rabbis decreed that someone should treat the produce of the Am Haaretz as though it's going to be like true doubt as to whether the Am Haaretz tithed it or not, despite the fact, by the way, that the Am Haaretz says that the produce is tithed. And most Am Haaretzes are going to say that, oh yeah, it's tithed, no problem, it's fine. And you see that today in the modern world. People will say that, oh yeah, it's kosher. But when you really look at it from a careful halachic eye, you'll see that a lot of times the Am Haaretzim are not really handling food in the highest level of kashrut. It's the same thing here with tithes, and you're not allowed to rely on their word for the tithes. So that's going to be one way. The other way is going to be that in all likelihood the produce was already tithed, and then the enactment is going to be a rabbinic stringency. Now, in the first way, you're going to have a way where you're dealing with actual doubtful tevel, because you can't rely on the Am Haaretz, and perhaps he didn't tithe it. And there's a real doubt as whether it's tithed or not. You're going to see that, by the way, today. Today you have to treat everything as if no tithes were taken out, unless you know that there's like a kosher organization that's reliable that handled it. But the question in this time frame, because again, we have to look at about it in this time frame when this ruling came down, is it going to be treated like doubtful tevel, like perhaps the Am Haaretz didn't tithe at all, and you can't really trust them, or is it going to be that they tithe the Truma Gedola, so it's not actual tevel, and then the rest is just going to be out of a rabbinic stringency? So the Gemara here is going to be showing that the requirement, according to Rabbi Yossi, for Demai is just a rabbinic stringency. And this, by the way, this dispute comes up between Abaya and Rava in Bavli Shabbos 23a, and that's basically going to be the question here, is going to be whether this is going to be where you have to assume that this is like doubtful tevel, or whether you have to assume that that set of tithes has been taken out, and then there's extra restrictions for rabbinic ideas in there. So over here, we're dealing with where you don't know whether or not the Maaser Sheni has been removed from the produce. Okay, that's really going to be where we are at this period of time. And keep in mind that tevel in this day is going to be biblical tevel. And it's not going to be known whether the Maaser Sheni had been previously or properly separated from it. And now you could have a question where perhaps the Maaser Sheni that gets taken out is actually now possibly going to be Maaser Sheni on a Doraita level. So then in a case where you have to rule stringently in a matter of doubt regarding biblical law, but if the rabbis are going to be treating it like doubtful tevel, then when you're looking at taking out the Maaser Sheni out of Demai, then you might actually have Maaser Sheni on a Doraita level. And then that becomes a question that becomes hard to understand. And then we have to go back to the Onin, because if you have where it could be the Maaser Sheni on a biblical level, then why is it on Demai in the Mishnah that they're saying that the Onin can eat the Maaser Sheni of Demai? And what that's pointing to where it's not really regarded in the first case where the rabbis are decreeing that one should treat the produce by the Am Haaretz as if it's really a true doubt as to whether this has been tithed or not. And really you have to look at the second case where you have to assume that the produce was already tithed, and that now everything else is just a rabbinic stringency. So if it hadn't been tithed and you now are taking out the Maaser Sheni, that's Maaser Sheni, that's probably Demai. That's probably Doraita, not Demai, but probably Doraita. In a case where it's already been, the Truma Gedola from the Amaretz has already been taken out, now when you're taking out the Maaser Sheni, that Maaser Sheni is going to be Maaser Sheni of Demai, and that's that leniency on why the Onin is going to be allowed to do it. And if this was a case where there was a real doubt as to whether this was going to be, really like tevel, and then you're taking it out, then it could be where the Onin would not be allowed to eat it, because now in a case of doubt, you have to rule stringently on a Doraita thing, in a case of doubt on a Doraita thing. So really what they're trying to show here is they're trying to show this case where no, the produce was probably already tied by the Amaretz with the Truma Gedola, and now when you're taking it out, that's why, by the way, the Onin's going to be allowed to eat the Maaser Sheni of Demai, but would not be allowed to eat the doubtful Maaser Sheni if it were on a Doraita level. So the Mishnah now is going to teach that someone who redeems Maaser Sheni of Demai does not need to pay the surcharge of the fifth. Now, this is really another important insight, because if we had where we don't really know if the tithes were taken out at all by the Amaretz. We don't even know if the Truma Gedola was taken out. By the way, that's going to be the case today. You have to assume that, they didn't take out anything. But in this time, if we, again, have the Maaser Sheni that's going to be doubtful on a biblical level, then you would have to add a fifth. But you see over here that we do not pay the surcharge of the fifth according to the Mishnah. And again, what this is trying to teach is that these are going to be, that Demai and the tithing and the subsequent tithes are going to be treated as rabbinic stringencies. And that really changes the matter for all of this. Because again, if it's going to be doubt on the rabbinic level, then these stringencies, you have to keep them. So you'd have to take out the fifth. The Onin would not be allowed to eat it. The mourner would not be allowed. The mourner not be allowed to eat it. Also, you have to eat a state of tuma. You can't do things. You're very limited when you're going and taking it outside of the walls of Jerusalem. Things like that. And we're not seeing that for Demai. So, ergo, what this is trying to teach us is that really, we have to assume that Amaretz in this time was separating out Truma Gedola. That's really what this is trying to teach, and it's trying to limit us onto, what is going to be the status of Demai. So, again, we're going to get into this question of the surcharge of the fifth, and it says that we learned in a Mishnah elsewhere. This is going to be in Baba Metzia 4.8. In the Bavli, it's going to be 55b. And it's going to say that a non-Kohen who accidentally ate Truma Maaser, Truma or Truma Maaser or Truma Maaser of Demai, has to pay its value plus the surcharge of the fifth. Yet here in this Mishnah, it says this. It says that our Mishnah is ruling that the requirement of paying a fifth does not apply to the Maaser Sheni of Demai. Now, that's a big contradiction. What's going to be the difference? And again, anytime you see a contradiction between a Mishnah, it's your job to try to unravel it, unpack it, and try to get an understanding of what these are doing. And you have to try to reconcile it, because that's part of the avoda. That's part of the work of trying to dig into understanding the halachot. Rabbi Zera says, to resolve this contradiction, the Mishnah there, which is going to be in Baba Metzia, is talking about where it requires a surcharge of a fifth, and that speaks of a non-Kohen who accidentally ate the Truma Maaser of Demai. But the Mishnah here, where it does not require the surcharge, is referring to someone who redeems the Maaser Sheni of Demai. And that's going to be, although, the rabbis waived this fifth surcharge with respect to Maaser Sheni of Demai, they did not do it with regards to the Trumas Maaser of Demai. That's what the point of Rabbi Zera is saying to resolve these two. And Rabbi Imi has a dissent, and he says that the Mishnah does not exclude Trumas Maaser of Demai. And he's basically saying, Rabbi Imi is basically saying that the Mishnah's leniency applies to both Maaser Sheni of Demai and Trumas Maaser of Demai. And there's really no contradiction between the Mishnahs, as the Gemara is going to come and explain. Rabbi Imi is going to explain where there's no contradiction, and the some of the notes to help explain it is going to come from the Vilna Goan. So regarding the Mishnah, this is also referring to Trumas Maaser of Demai, and the Gemara says, now what will be the solution to the contradiction between the two Mishnahs? And the answer is the Mishnah there, again, reading this with the notes of the Vilna Goan in it, says, which rules that the Trumas Maaser of Demai is subject to a fifth, and that follows the view of Rabbi Meir. Whereas the Mishnah here, which exempts it from a fifth, follows the view of the sages. And Rabbi Meir is basically treating the rabbinic decrees, in this case of Demai, with some severity, or the same severity as biblical law, in this case, definite Trumas Maaser. Now, the Vilna Goan proceeds to explain it like this. He's saying that, therefore, Rabbi Meir would rule that just as definite Trumas Maaser is subject to a surcharge, so too the Trumas Maaser of Demai is going to be subject to a surcharge. And this is going to be the position adopted by the other Mishnah. Now, this Mishnah, by contrast, is going to be following the sages, who are more lenient with the rabbinic decrees than with biblical laws. Now, again, the Vilna Gaon is pointing out that how do you reconcile, according to Rabbi Imi, the two Mishnahs? The Mishnah over there is talking about Rabbi Meir's point, and the Mishnah over here is talking about the opinion of the rabbis and the sages. So over here, the rabbis are going to be more lenient on rabbinic decrees, and the Mishnah is going to be ruling in here that Trumas Maaser of Demai is going to be, since it's only rabbinic requirement, going to be exempt from that surcharge. Again, by the way, if we were dealing with a case of, and everybody would agree that if you were dealing in a case where, the Amma Aretz might not have separated out Truma Gedola at all, and you're dealing with a case of definite Tevel, then even the sages would agree that when you separate out the Maaser Sheni, ultimately, that would be subject to tithes, because again, that's going to be Maaser Sheni on a doubtful biblical level. We are dealing with where we're assuming under the laws of Demai that Truma Gedola was taken out. And so because of that, it skews all of these laws. Okay, it skews all of these laws. When we're reading these laws, okay, we're reading these only in the perspective that the Truma Gedola was taken out, so this is not definite Tevel, or even suspect Tevel. And that's why the rest of these are going to be treated with these leniencies. And you would end up with all sorts of different rulings where actually it wouldn't even be Demai anymore. Just everything would be a suffix on a Deraita thing. And so you'd be ruling stringently on everything. All of these would be stringent. But, these are in here, chapter 1, Halacha 2, to point out all of these leniencies and to point out this very, very deep point that we have to assume that Amma Aretz at this time has separated out the Truma Gedola, because again, the laws would not look like this. So Rabbi Zera, says Vilna Gaon, is going to resolve the contradiction between the Mishnahs by saying that in this Mishnah, it's going to exempt Demai from the law of a fifth, and that's going to be speaking of the redeeming the Maaser Sheni, where the Mishnah over there is going to be considering even Demai subject to the law of the fifth, and that's going to be with regard to the penalty of eating Trumas Maaser of Demai. Now, Rabbi Zera is going to go to explain why the rabbis are more stringent with regard to Trumas Maaser of Demai. So the Gemara says that Rabbi Zera says in the name of the rabbis, rightfully in the case of Trumas Maaser of Demai, a non-Kohen who eats it accidentally should not have set aside a fifth, because Maaser Sheni of Demai is merely a rabbinic origin. So the Gemara continues, it says, so why did the rabbis say that he should set aside a fifth? And the idea is that they are required for the fifth for the sake of its protection, says the Gemara, to protect the sanctity of the Truma Maaser of Demai. And the Gemara continues and says, for if you were to tell him that he need not set aside the additional fifth, he might not treat Trumas Maaser of Demai with sanctity. And the idea here, says the Vilna Goan, is that if we're lenient with a non-Kohen with regard to eating Trumas Maaser of Demai, even accidentally, he might feel encouraged to eat it intentionally. And again, this is going to be another restriction like the Onin eating the Maaser Sheni in the state of Tuma, that they kept this restriction on because, over here with the Onin, they didn't want to have a degradation in the eyes of the Jewish people for the Kedusha and eating it in the state of Kedusha as the Torah commands us. And over here, the rabbis, in a similar way, according to Rabbi Zera, is afraid that if you roll back even for the Maaser Sheni of Demai eaten accidentally by a non-Kohen, and that they're going to not pay the 1/5, that they're going to lose regard even for the Maaser Sheni of Demai and end up eating it on purpose and not accidentally and not paying the 5th. So by keeping in the 5th, even though it's really just like a rabbinic requirement, really what they're trying to do is preserve it. And in this argument, Rabbi Zera is going to explain why a similar decree was not passed to protect the Maaser Sheni of Demai. So the Gemara continues, and it says, rightfully, in the case of Maaser Sheni of Demai as well, one should have to set aside a 5th for redeeming it. So why did the rabbis say that he does not have to set aside a 5th? In other words, why did they keep them exempted from a 5th, for eating it, for eating the Maaser Sheni? And the Gemara says, for the sake of its protection. In other words, to protect the Maaser Sheni of Demai. And the Gemara says, for if you were to tell him that he should set aside a 5th when he redeems the Maaser Sheni, he might not separate Maaser Sheni of Demai at all. And then he would avoid being subject to the surcharge. So the issue that the rabbis are facing here is that if they're too strict with the Maaser Sheni of Demai, according to Rabbi Zera, and they're not going to do they are going to impose the surcharge, then what's going to happen is then people are going to stop separating Maaser Sheni of Demai at all. They're not going to follow it because the penalty will be too high. They'll lose the incentive to do it, and then nobody will be separating it. So the Mishnah's next lenient ruling regarding Demai is going to be on the small portion of Demai that can be abandoned on a roadside. Now again, something that has Kedusha, if you're finding it by the roadside, like say a set of tefillin, you're supposed to protect it and preserve it. So if you had definite Maaser Sheni that was on the roadside, you'd have to pick it up and preserve it and protect it and make sure it doesn't become Demai. But with regard to a small portion of Demai, Maaser Sheni of Demai, you can just leave it there. So Rabbi Bon Barchia asked in this Gemara in the presence of Rabbi La, he says, why do I need the Mishnah to specify Demai? And this leniency should apply even to definite Truma. And why do I need the Mishnah to specify a small amount? This leniency should apply even to a large amount. So that's a good question. In other words, even if the Truma is going to be on the road, and the worry could be that perhaps it's going to go to waste or something. So the Gemara says, did a Baraisa not teach the following? We need not bring Truma from the threshing floor to the city to give it to a Kohen, nor from an uninhabited area to an inhabited area. Rather, the Kohen has to travel to the threshing floor or an uninhabited area to collect the Truma himself. So, yes, the Torah is commanding you to give the Truma to a Kohen, but that means that the Truma belongs to the tribe of the Kohanim, and when the Kohen claims it, you have to give it to him. But you don't need to go waste your time or spend your time to go find a Kohen to do it. It's going to be on the Kohen, who's the owner, to come and collect the truma for himself. Again, the Kohen is the owner, but he has to come collect it. So over here, where you're finding this on the ground, the question is, why is it specifying a small amount? So the Gemara says, however, if the truma was in a place where wild animals can drag it away, the owner must bring it to the city or inhabited area and give it to the Kohen. But he may take money from the Kohen there as a compensation for bringing it. So this is going to look a lot like the laws of Shulchas Aveda, right? So this belongs to the tribe of the Kohanim, and if you find it there on the road, you have to protect it. And in the case of this being, Truma Gedola, you have to protect it from becoming Demai, and you have to bring it to an area where Kohanim couldn't find it, and you have to return it back to a Kohen. Because it's unlikely that a Kohen is going to go find it in a road, and wild animals are going to go eat it. And again, this is for the Kohen to eat, not the wild animals to eat. By the way, there are provisions for food for wild animals. That's going to be the shvius produce. That's going to be left to hefker. That's going to be allowed to wild animals. That's fine. But over here, this is going to be for the tribe of Kohanim. Now, again, if you're finding a good amount of this on the side of a road, and it's going to be, Trumas Gedola, then, you have to bring it in because, again, it's lost from the tribe of Kohanim, and it's like you're bringing it in. So, if the truma, says the Rosh Cirilio, if the truma is in an area, with wild animals, the rabbis decreed that he does not need to leave it there, and the consumption by the animals would constitute a degradation of the sanctity and destruction of the produce, and in fact a desecration of Hashem's name. So he brings it down to town and he informs the Kohanim that it's available, and the Kohen who gets it can pay for the cost of the transport. So you're allowed to charge for your time and also for the transport, just like the laws of Shulchas Aveda. Now, what's going to be different here? So I want to point out what the Marafulda is saying about this. And basically what he's saying is that the Bryce is implying that even if there's a large quantity of this and it's available and it's definite truma, okay, somehow, it's in a bag that's marked truma, okay, so it's definite truma. The idea is that he can leave it in an uninhabited area, provided there's small danger of it being taken by the animals, even if it could go to waste there. And this would contradict this Mishnah, which seemingly allows one to abandon Maaser Sheni only if it's just a small amount of it, and only if it's going to be Demai. So again, it looks like a contradiction that could be between these two Mishnahs, that if we can leave for the Kohen where whereas our Mishnah is speaking of the Maaser Sheni, and where the question is why not just take this? Why not just take this also? So Rabbi Law is going to explain it, and we're going to use some of the notes from the Chazan Ish to help us to understand it. So Rabbi Law is going to explain it like this. He's going to say to Rabbi Ban Bar Chia, the Brisa doesn't mean what you're saying it means. And the Gemara says that there is no obligation to return lost property to the rightful owner. So basically what this is saying is that the Brisa is implying that, says the Vilna, says the Chazan Ish, that if the truma were in any other place where it might be lost before a Kohen can come collect it, he can leave it there. And therefore the mitzvah of returning lost property does not apply to truma, presumably because it is the collective property of the tribe of the Kohanim, and there's no real specific owner that you can individually identify to return it. Rather, again, it's going to be the Kohen's responsibility to go collect the truma for himself. And Rabbi Ban Barchia is objecting that since the Brisa allows even one to go to let even a large amount of definite truma be lost before a kohen can arrive, the question is, why does this Mishnah limit its permit to a small amount of trumas Maaser of Demai? And I want to point out the part of the insight here from the Marafulda, and we'll get into a note by the Rabbi Moshe Feinstein on this. Rabbi Law is saying that, in fact, the mitzvah of returning lost property does not apply to truma, and even if it's going to be rabbinic truma, because it lacks a specific owner. That's the idea. So in the case of Shulchas Aveda, when you have lost grain, right? And we're going to follow the laws of Shulchas Aveda. Fine. Well, there's a guy who owns this grain, and you're trying to return it back to a specific person. But in the case here, let's say a sack that's marked Truma, Truma Gedola, well, it belongs to the tribe of the Kohanim in general. And again, the obligation is for the individual Kohen to go collect it, to go claim it. So it's, according to Rabbi Law, not really like Shulchas Aveda at all, because, again, you don't know which guy to specifically return it to. How do you return it back to the tribe of the Kohanim? And that's why this is going to be permitted to leave there. That's going to be the idea. And over here, the question is, what about a case of the Trumas Maaser of Demai? And the Beurim, Rabbi Moshe Feinstein commentary about this is going to point out that that the Mishnah does not allow one to leave a small amount of Truma Maaser of Demai, since the mitzvah of returning lost property is only rabbinic in this context. And the rabbis had the authority to waive it here, and they didn't. So, that's another thing, that they didn't waive it. And in this context here, this Maaser Sheni of Demai anyway is going to be rabbinic. So, according to the way we look at this brisa, it's going to be indicating that someone is forbidden to abandon any amount of definite truma or trumas Maaser, but one can abandon a small amount of truma Maaser of Demai. And that's going to be really the big chiddush here, is that one of them, you can abandon, but the other one you can't. So that's interesting. How do we understand this? And Rabbi Yossi is going to explain this and help clear this up for us. Rabbi Yossi says that in the context, there is a mitzvah to return lost property only in the case of a small amount, where there's little effort required to bring it to a kohen. But where there is no mitzvah to return lost property in the case of a large amount, where there's considerable effort. And the preceding, says the Gemara, the preceding applies to definite truma or definite trumas Maaser. But in the case of Demai, or the case of trumas Maaser of Demai, there's no mitzvah to return lost property at all. And as we learned here in our Mishnah, we may abandon a small portion of it on the road. So, according to the Vilna Goan, Rabbi Yossi is saying that the difference between a small amount and a large amount is going to be how Rabbi Yossi is going to understand it. And the rabbis are lenient even with a small amount, which is going to require little effort to carry, and certainly with a large amount, which is going to require a large amount. And Rabbi Yossi understands the Mishnah to mean that one may abandon even a small amount of Demai on the roadside, and certainly a large amount. And according to Rabbi Yossi, says the Rosh, one may abandon any amount of Trumas Maaser of Demai and a large amount of definite Truma or Trumas Maaser. And this is in contrast to Rabbi Law, who permits someone to abandon only a small amount of Trumas Maaser of Demai and not be allowed to abandon any amount of definite Truma or Trumas Maaser. Rabbi Yossi is bringing up the following point. Rabbi Yossi is saying, well, in the laws of Shulchas Aveda, if there's a giant amount and it's too big for you to handle, you don't need to do it. And so he's saying that when we're talking about allowing a small amount to remain, okay, fine, you can leave a small amount because the rabbis are being lenient here. And, the rabbis are being lenient with a small amount because there's no effort to carry it. And he's basically understanding the mission to mean that one can abandon even a small amount or Maaser Sheni of Demai on the roadside. Rabbi La is saying that you can only abandon a small amount. Rabbi Yosei is basically saying it's Demai, and you can leave even a small amount or a large amount. And by the way, Rabbi Yossi is saying that you can abandon any amount, whether it's big or small, of Trumas Maaser of Demai. And whether you have, let's say you have a very, very large amount of Truma Gedola, Trumas Maaser, and again you would know this because it would be marked in the bag. Rabbi Yossi is basically saying that if a very, very large amount is abandoned, you can leave it. And again, that's not the case with Rabbi La. Rabbi La is saying that only a small amounts can be abandoned, and if you know that there's definite, Truma Maaser or Trumas Gedola, that's going to be, actually like Deraita, not Demai, that you have to go try to find a Kohen, and you have to return it to the Kohen. So the last discussion was talking about Trumas Maaser of Demai, and the Gemara now is going to talk about the context of Maaser Sheni of Demai. And, the Gemara says, so far we know that in the Mishnah we can abandon Maaser Sheni of Demai on the roadside, and when does one not have money in the possession with which to redeem it? And it says, but if there is money in his possession, what is the law? Does he have to redeem the Maaser Sheni to prevent the sanctity from becoming lost, or can he leave it as it is? So we know that we were talking about, leaving a small amount and abandoning a small amount, and now you have a case where you have the money, and the question is, if it's going to be very hard to transfer the money and to, take it and to redeem it and spend it properly. Can you just leave it there as money? And in other words, just leave it there. Do you and just not redeem it? That's really what he's asking. And there's an incident to resolve this question. Rabbi Nehumi, the son of Rabbi Chia Barba, says that my father had money in his pouch, but he did not use it to deconsecrate a small amount of Maaser Sheni of Demai that he found on the roadside. Rather, he abandoned it there. And the Gemara is going to notice and says the ruling of Rabbi Chia Barba is basically following the view of Rabbi Zera, who is understanding that the Mishnah's ruling is applying to the Maaser Sheni of Demai. And the incident here says in Pnei Moshe about what the son of Rabbi Chia Barba is reporting is basically saying that Rabbi Chia Barba abandoned Maaser Sheni of Demai. He didn't deconsecrate it. And this is going to basically be like the point of Rabbi Zera, who's understanding the Mishnah's leniencies as applying to the Maaser Sheni of Demai. So the Gemara continues, says, and the statement of Rabbi La in the Gemara is going to follow the opinion of Rabbi Imi, who's holding that the ruling pertains to Trumas Maaser of Demai. So what we see here is we're seeing that the formulation by Rabbi La and Rabbi Imi is talking about Trumas Maaser of Demai. And the formulation of Rabbi Chia Barba and Rabbi Zera is talking about Maaser Sheni of Demai. And this Gemara does give a solution to help understand, this sort of back and forth between Rabbi Imi, Rabbi La, Rabbi Zera, and Rabbi Chia Barba. And to try to understand it. Now, the Gemara is going to define what constitutes a small amount of Maaser Sheni of Demai, whose abandonment on the roadside is permitted. Again, we're not talking about Trumas Maaser of Demai that's abandoned on the road. This is really, like Rabbi Zera is pointing out, just talking about Maaser Sheni of Demai. So the Gemara says that in the academy of Rabbi Yanai, this, by the way, is going to be the teacher of Rabbi Yochanan, they said it is permitted to abandon that which is smaller than that is considered food. In other words, smaller than an egg's volume, and this refers to a piece of bread. So we know that an egg's volume is a minimum measure of a lot of different kinds of foods, like when you're going to eat a minimum amount of bread for saying the brachas, and then the Gemara is going to talk about the case of what happens if there's a loaf of bread or the volume of a dried fig. So there's a dissenting opinion. Rabbi Yochanan says in the name of Rabbi Shimon ben Yitzodak, in the case of a whole loaf, the permitted volume is up to the volume of a dried fig, but in the case of a piece, even if it is larger than the size of an egg, it is permitted. So Rabbi Yochanan is going to agree with the academy of Rabbi Yanai with regards to the whole loaf, but is going to be more lenient with regards to a piece of bread. And that's going to be surprising. The Gemara is going to be surprised also about this leniency of Rabbi Yochanan here. And it's going to ask, what do they disagree? Is it possible that Rabbi Yochanan is going to really allow someone to abandon a piece larger than the size of an egg? And the Gemara quotes a different version of Rabbi Yochanan's ruling. Rabbi Mana says, this is the extent which they disagree. In the academy of Rabbi Yanai, they said it is permitted to abandon that which is smaller than food, smaller than the egg's volume. And in the case of a piece of bread, in the case of a whole loaf, the permitted amount is up to the volume of a dried fig. And Rabbi Yochanan is saying that in the name of Rabbi Shimon ben Yitzodak, whether it is a piece or a whole loaf, the permitted amount is going to be the volume of a dried fig, and that's going to be interesting because Rabbi Yochanan is basically being stricter, and Rabbi Yanai is basically not allowing even a piece to be abandoned if it's the size of a dried fig, but with regard to a whole loaf, he agrees with them. So that ends up where Rabbi Yochanan ends up being more strict. And there's going to be a halachic inquiry, and then we'll finish this up. And Rabbi Hoshaya asks and says, what is the law with regard to separating a small amount of Maaser Sheni of Demai in order to abandon it? Do you have to separate out a small amount of Maaser Sheni of Demai with the intent to abandon it? And that question is unresolved. In other words, you can leave out a small amount on the road, but what about if you're actually saying, like, I'm going to separate a small amount of Maaser Sheni of Demai with the intent, by the way, to actually abandon it? Can you do that? Unresolved. Mishnah says one may give Maaser Sheni of Demai to an Am Haaretz, but one must eat a corresponding amount in Jerusalem. The Gemara is going to finish and say that the leniency applies to the Maaser Sheni of Demai, but not to definite Maaser Sheni, because we may not give definite Maaser Sheni to the Am Haaretz. And that is going to be whether it is for planting rather than eating. I'm sorry, it's going to be for eating, not just for planting. We're going to get into what about for planting in Halacha 3 if you're giving them seed and you're not sure whether they're going to eat it or plant it, and we're going to get into that tomorrow. Anyway, have a great day, and we'll do it again tomorrow.